Hello, my loves, and welcome back to an episode of Strange Playgrounds. It's been a while. It's been a while since I had just a singular episode of Strange Playgrounds. Lots of other stuff happening around the channel, but not a Strange Playgrounds episode. I think the last one was when I reviewed Hellraiser 2022, which has definitely split the audience. I mean, some people love it, some people very much do not. I really liked it, as you well know. Sort of on the back of that, for Halloween this year, as well as all my usual rituals and whatnot, I've just been revisiting lots and lots and lots of horror films that I haven't seen for a very, very, very long time. So I went back and watched Alien, I went back and watched the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, classic horrors. I rewatched the original Night of the Living Dead, which was a wonderful experience. Haven't seen that for such a long time. I mean, in order to fully appreciate the Night of the Living Dead, you really do need to go and look at what was happening culturally and politically in the US around the time of its production, in the years just leading up to its production and release, because it's difficult to pinpoint a particular beginning of where a new wave of horror starts to reflect what's happening in culture very, very specifically. But Night of the Living Dead is a very good marker. It's problematic, as all of these things often are. There will be films before it that did likewise, but Night of the Living Dead is certainly the most iconic marker of where American mainstream horror cinema started to become powerfully culturally reflexive, highly politicized, and just counterculture, as all the best horror is. I mean, John Carpenter says in an interview, I believe it's in an interview you can find knocking about here on YouTube, called The Horror Cafe. You've got Clive Barker, and you've got John Carpenter, and you've got myriad sort of horror luminaries gathered around a table. Pete Atkins is there, a couple of other people, talking about the nature of horror and horror cinema. And one of the things John Carpenter talks about is the difference between left-wing horror and right-wing horror, which is, it's not necessarily the case that the kinds of horror that he's talking about are aligned with those political poles. Rather, what he's defining is a split in two very different types of horror. And right-wing horror tells you that it's the classic fairy tale horror, it's the more traditional horror, it's the horror of the outside, it's the horror that the evil is out there somewhere, it's alien, it's foreign, and if you don't do as you're told, if you don't conform, if you don't stay around the campfire, it will get you. If you go wandering out into the deep dark woods, it will get you. Left-wing horror, he says, basically states that the horror actually is here. It's around the campfire, it's in the tribe, and it's in you. It's part of who we are, it's part of our traditions, it's part of our history, and it must be faced, it must be acknowledged, or it will destroy us. And a lot of the classic horror is very right-wing in nature. I mean, even stuff that's created by otherwise very liberal, very left-wing people. I mean, John Carpenter himself, he did not intend to sort of put a full stop at the end of the sexual revolution begun in the 1960s with Halloween. But Halloween is probably the archetypal right-wing horror film. It's an excellent horror film. It's wonderful, but it is very conservative in terms of its ideology. You know, it's about the fear of children. It's about the intergenerational fear. So the fear of parents not for their children, but of their children. The notion that there is something in the children that were born of the 60s and 70s, those who were the children of sexual liberation and of feminism and of civil rights, that there is something alien and unquantifiable that traditional ideology cannot contain and cannot impose itself upon. And what Halloween paints those children as is monsters, psychopaths, and unknowable. I mean, Michael Myers is that child. That's the irony. It's this entire blank of morality, and the fact that he goes around killing teenagers who are sexually active and who take drugs. It is effectively like the revenge fantasy of conservative parents of the 1950s for those who were children in the 60s, who were parts of the counterculture that came about in the 1960s. I mean, the gulf, the abyssal gulf between the generations of like the parents of the 1950s and those who were children and young adults in the 1960s, arguably hasn't been so profound until now. There is, in present day culture, both in the US and the UK, a similarly abyssal gulf, which I think, and it started, interestingly, it spans multiple generations. I would argue that separation began with the generation prior to mine, which is Generation X. I mean, it's a weird one. I mean, where you draw the parameters as to what qualifies as this generation or that is largely arbitrary. But for the purposes of this discussion, it is kind of useful. I'm on the border. I'm what's sometimes called a Xennial. So I'm on the border, on the very tail end of Generation X and the very beginning of the Millennials. So I'm kind of like the youngest member of Generation X and the oldest member of the Millennial generation. It's a really strange place to be. I was born in 1984, which is the beginning of technically the millennial generation, but also the tail end of Generation X. And I think the gulf between my generation and our parents it's abyssal. I think it is irreconcilable. I really do. And I don't mean that in the sense that we are all alienated from our parents or that we all hate one another. We don't. That's just not the case. That is simply not the case. But there is an ideological and even an existential space between us where it's often like we're on different planets. It's often like that we're even different species, that we see the world in different ways, that we want different things from the world, that we perceive things differently. And that leads to intergenerational conflict and trauma. And I'm sure if you examine the horror that's coming out now, and certainly in the 1990s, you will see that. You will see that manifested in many and varied ways. But Night of the Living Dead is it's the beginning of what a lot of documentaries call the American Nightmare, which is horror as it's performing the function that nightmares are sometimes claimed to have psychologically, but for an entire culture. So the things that cultures are not willing to face or have difficulty processing because they conflict with their identities and their assumptions of themselves, that's what horror does at its very best. And surprise, surprise, I will always go for the counterculture horror. I will always go for the left-wing horror. That said, I like Halloween. I hate slasher films. I mean, I don't mean that in the sense that I ideologically opposed to them. I'm not. I don't mind the fact that they exist, but I don't get anything out of them. Friday the 13th, I just can't sit and watch a film in that series because it's boring to me. It's totally uninteresting. I'm not interested in a killer going around killing teenagers for having sex. It conflicts with what I want from media ideologically, but also on a purely aesthetic and subject matter level, I find that dull. I'm just not interested in that. For me, that boils down to a very simple format, which is you're just waiting in between kills, and that's it, to see how they're done. And that's it. And don't get me wrong, you can have a lot of fun with that. In the 1990s, when you started to get the saturation of the slasher film and you started to get self-reflexive slasher films, then it became interesting again. For me, certainly. So Scream, for example, the first 3 Scream films, which are wonderful parodies of the genre, made by people who are partially responsible for establishing the genre, are amazing. Absolutely amazing, because they're so self-aware and they're satires of the slasher film and of horror in general are so sharp, they're so on point, that it makes them engaging again. It makes them funny, it makes them ironic, it layers everything up with these wonderful variations of flavour and texture, and that makes the slasher format far more interesting. You got later on stuff like Final Destination, which is the ultimate parody of the slasher film, surely, because it's the slasher film sans the killer. You don't need the guy running around with the machete or the knife in the mask, because it's death itself that's coming for you. And that makes it a bit more interesting. You got examples from that era that were not quite as successful but which are conceptually interesting, like for example Cherry Falls. Cherry Falls takes the whole rule of the slasher film that if you have sex you die. That is an ironclad rule of the slasher film. If you are sexually active as a teenager in these films, you die. Cherry Falls inverts it, so it's actually the killer is killing virgins, which is actually a very clever and interesting way of taking it. It's not 100% successful because it doesn't go as far or as deep or as dark with it as it should, but it is fascinating. That film ultimately devolves into a classic slasher film, which is you're just waiting between kills. But Scream was another one that I actually revisited. And I love Halloween, which is arguably the most right-wing, the most archetypal of the conservative horror films, but I think it works exactly because of that. I think that's what it's coherency, it's its purity, its ideological purity that makes it work, and the fact that it technically established the rules of this genre. It wasn't the first film like that. There are lots before it. In fact, you can go back very, 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 very far indeed and find some very interesting examples from early cinema that kind of meet the slasher film criteria. But most people would say that Halloween is the icon. It's the one where the rules were crystallized and made sort of made concrete in stone and blood. But generally, by and large, those films are not for me because they bore me. They bore me ideologically. They're not really saying very much. They're not really doing very much that intrigues me. It's stuff like Hellraiser that intrigues me. Obviously, it's stuff that has metaphysics. It's stuff that has deeper or wider application. I watched a couple of Cronenberg films. I watched Shivers, which is an amazing film. Shivers it's a really wonderfully ambiguous piece of work. It's really difficult watching it to determine what side Cronenberg himself as the creator is on ideologically. It's definitely a response to sexual revolution. There's no way you can watch Shivers and believe that that's not the case or miss that, because it's overt. The metaphor is overt. What's difficult to discern by watching the film is what side ideologically Cronenberg comes down on, because he is such a competent filmmaker that he is aware that there are ideological complexities whichever way you turn. So he doesn't go for the easy answer. He puts those complexities up on screen. So the final sequence of Shivers could be read as a celebration in many respects. It's the birth of a new era. It's technically the beginning of a new age of humanity. But it's also highly, highly ambiguous. It could be a very dark age. It could be a very bloody short age. If the parasites that incite human beings to these wild acts of sexual liberation, if they cause sort of the collapse of everything else because of that, if there is no desire or want to maintain things, and if human beings become basically auto-cannibalistic in a sexual sense and just die in these vast orgies, then it's going to be a very short age, isn't it? But the point of Shivers, certainly the point of the man who creates the parasites, because that is a thing. The parasites in Shivers were created by a man who wanted that exact scenario. He wants all of the history of humanity erased. He wants all of the complexity of humanity, the complex histories and ideologies and traditions and societies and nations and philosophies to just collapse in on themselves in a great mindless sexual apocalypse. And that is not what Cronenberg dares to say in that film, is that it's not necessarily a bad thing. Maybe that's not a terrible thing. Returning to that state of atavism, or I mean, assuming there ever was that state in us to begin with, but transcending into that state of atavism. That's another thing the film seems to suggest, that there is a transcendence occurring here, and that by fighting against it, you are fighting against the coming of a new age. You are fighting against the inevitable, and that is ideologically fascinating. I mean, you're going to get this from Cronenberg. Anything Cronenberg creates, you are going to get this. I rewatched The Fly. The Fly is one of my favourite films ever made. It's one of my favourite films in any genre ever. It is stunningly, grotesquely beautiful. It's one of those rare remakes that is head and shoulders above its original, and yes, that is a pun, by the way. It is head and shoulders above the original film, which just has Vincent Price running around with a big sort of papier-mâché fly on his head. And it takes the material which might otherwise be risible, which is essentially Jeff Goldblum transmuting over the course of the film into a kind of human fly hybrid, and makes it not only powerfully moving, pathetic in the original sense of that term, the dramatic sense of pathetic, but as in of pathos, but also ideologically fascinating. The themes of The Fly are married to waxing concerns in Western culture of the 1970s and the 80s. So you've got this escalating knowledge, thanks to media access in the 70s and the 80s, of medical concerns. Things like cancer is huge in news media. Here in the UK and in the US throughout the 80s and the 90s, particularly very sort of grubby tabloid kind of right-wing presses, everything gave you cancer. Cancer was everywhere. Cancer was this, cancer was that. It was designed to scare you, right? It's a way of selling information, what markets itself as information through fear. And it works. It works really well, which is why if you go back over like the monthly issues of the weekly issues of the Daily Mail back in the 1980s and 90s, every other front page is about cancer. Something causes cancer. Bread causes cancer. Wood causes cancer. Everything causes cancer, right? Well, The Fly takes those concerns and makes them manifest. The gradual, highly visual collapse of Jeff Goldblum in this film is highly redolent of a cancer victim, and that's very deliberate on Cronenberg's part. Of course, you also have a sincere pandemic occurring back then, which is, of course, the AIDS pandemic, which desolated entire communities. I mean, entire communities. And communities which, by the by, were just left by the societies of which they were part, the cultures of which they were part, the systems of which they were part, left to die and suffer because of who we were, you know? And that's up on screen too in The Fly. It is a brilliant piece of work. It's grisly, it's disgusting, it's gross, it's very hard to watch. It's body horror in its quintessence. It is literally watching the collapse and transformation of a human body on screen. And it is absolutely bloody incredible, with an amazing central performance from Jeff Goldblum. I mean, he is really good in this film. One that really surprised me this time around was a film that I haven't seen before. Technically, it's a remake of one of my favourite films ever, and I've assiduously avoided it because the very notion of a remake of this film is absurd. It is ironically spurious, which again, is a pun. I'm talking about the 2018 remake of Dario Argento's Suspiria. Now, the original Suspiria is an amazing piece of work. It is just remove it from horror cinema and just look at it as a piece of cinema, of visual storytelling. There is no one like Dario Argento for capturing the ethos and the logic of a nightmare in film. That's what that film is like. Nothing makes sense in Suspiria. Nothing makes sense. Architecturally, the dance school in which most of the action occurs makes no frigging sense. But it's not meant to. It works on an emotional level and it works on an imaginative level, and that there is the very point of the thing. There's that wonderful sequence where one of the characters is chased through the school by something you can't see and that she can't see. There's some unspoken, unseen horror. You know it's there, but you can only hear sounds, you can see sort of glimpses in the light and the shadow. All the angles are off, all the corridors are weird, dimension seems to stretch and distort, the structure of the school doesn't make any fucking sense. And then she falls from a window into a room or a corridor that's filled with razor wire. And it's in a dance school. In the whole latter half of that sequence is her struggling to get out of this hellish situation and lacerating herself even further until she ends up bleeding to death. It's quite incredible. The remake I have assiduously avoided because I just don't know how you do it. I don't know how you how you take a film like that is so much itself and successfully recreate it. And you know what? Just smack me blindsided. I can't believe it. But you know, the 2018 remake of Suspiria is absolutely brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. I can't get over how good a film it is. How do you do a remake of Suspiria? This film goes, haha, you don't. You don't. You take the base premise, the back mythology of the original film, which is highly evocative, implied. It's very difficult to work out what's going on without some sincere analysis of the imagery going on. It's never explicitly stated, but it basically involves a coven of witches operating at the school, doing this and that for whatever reason. You take that base mythology and you use it to tell an entirely other story. You use the same setting, the dance school, where there's a fish out of water character, there's a foreign student who has come. In is it the build-up or the aftermath to World War II? It's the aftermath, isn't it, to World War II. So everything is in shambles, everything is collapsing, and this school is struggling to sustain itself. But it is succeeding. It has a certain reputation as a result of the dancers that go there. And you use that premise to tell the story. Also, you make overt what is implied in the original film. This film makes no bones about the fact that, oh yeah, there's a coven of witches running this school. And it's absolutely overt. But it's done in such a beautiful way. This film is so cinematically aware of its own influences and history. The creators have made this a giant homage to 70s cinema, certainly 70s European horror cinema, underground cinema. It feels like watching Don't Look Now, or the works of Dario Argento himself. Giallo cinema is a huge influence here. It is utterly beautiful. It uses framing devices and camera movements that are typical of those traditions. And even the nature of the storytelling is like that. Although it's much more overt and narratively coherent than the original one, which is more of a nightmare piece, it still has this wonderful, dreamy quality to it, where it's just overt enough and just suggestive enough. It's really, really clever. It's also bloody horrific. It's difficult to know how far the film is going to go until quite a ways in, when you get the first real dance number from the fish out of water character, who's basically an American in a German dance school. And although the film doesn't explain it, it's as though she is inadvertently casting a spell by performing this dance number, and in doing so, she is puppeteering and brutally mutilating one of the other dancers in another room, in this room of mirrors. And it's as though she's almost sapping something from her, like she's taking something essential from her without knowing she's doing it. It's brilliant. It's grotesque. There's some incredible body horror going on here. Some very violent. I mean, like, wow, is this film violent, but in a very magical, mystical way. It's beautiful. I loved this film to bits. I can't believe what they've done. They've shown such respect for the original Dario Argento film, which is, you don't try to remake it. You do something different with it. It's as different, I would say, from... the best analogue I can think of is John Carpenter's The Thing from the 1980s, which is technically not a remake, but a film based around the same premises and story as The Thing from Outer Space, which is, of course, based on the short story Who Goes There. It is as different and as differently successful as those two films are. It's a wonderful film. I was enthralled. I was utterly, utterly enthralled by what they've done with this piece. It's atmospheric, it's strange, it's got its own weird, tangible atmosphere, which is post-war and dirty and guilty and uncertain about itself. There's ideological conflict within the coven, which is something you don't see in the Dario Argento one, because in the Dario Argento one, the mere existence of the coven is, like, suggested anyway. You don't even know it's there, technically, until the very end. Here it's overt. There is a coven of witches who are running this dance school, and they're doing all sorts of things to sustain themselves. They've got their own sort of internal set of politics and laws, which is in ruction because of the war and other things. And you have political and ideological conflict arising within this coven, which is part of the story. And it's brilliant. It's utterly, utterly brilliant. I just can't get over how much I love this film. It's a great example of how remakes can work. Can work beautifully. This is how you do it. You don't go for the pandering. You don't go for the shot-by-shot remake of the original film, but with a younger cast. You do this. You take the imagery, the premises, maybe even the back mythology, and you do something different with it. That's what this does, and I can't get over it. I really can't. It's been a great season. I must admit, I've really enjoyed revisiting some of these films. Some of them not so much. I revisited From Hell, the Johnny Depp vehicle, based on the popular comic book, which is all Jack the Ripper mythology bollocks. I don't mind the fact that it's Jack the Ripper mythology bollocks. I'm well into that. I like all that stuff. It's garbage, obviously. It's total wankery. But this film is like, it's like a pantomime. And it can be appreciated on that level, but it's got some problems, this one. It's got some real problems. I mean, Johnny, bless his heart, not doing the best accent, trying to do a little bit of the Cockney as Detective Inspector Aberline, and not really nailing it. Let's be fair. There is, I mean, because I know a lot about the Jack the Ripper cases. I read a lot about that case. The mythology that's attached to that particular incident is amazing. The bullshit that, this is a man who must have known medicine. No, he didn't. He ripped these women apart. There's no evidence whatsoever that he was a man of, like, surgery or anything like that. There's no evidence for that whatsoever. But that's one of the myths that's been attached to the case by fiction like this, that it must have been a surgeon or a butcher maybe, or a veterinarian or whatever, because he knew the human, but no, he didn't. No, he fucking didn't. He ripped those women to bits, hence the name. You know, it can be fun. I mean, it can be fun extrapolating. You can get some good fiction out of it, but this is problematic. It's kind of it's a bit too overproduced for one thing. It doesn't have. It's not quite as filthy and execrable as it wants you to believe that it is. I mean, alongside that, which is almost in many ways kind of a sister film to it, I watched the 1990s Sleepy Hollow, that also has Johnny Depp in it. That's similarly overproduced, but that's fun. That is fun. It is this stupid, big horror pantomime where everything is over the top and silly, and the performances are basically winking at the camera. In terms of like that's where you're at in terms of irony. It's winking at the camera. But it works. There is something about it that works really, really well. I like that film. There is a Halloween party quality to it. Everyone feels like they are actually in dress up and nothing feels quite real. And you've got Christopher Walken being weird and just that's all he does. That is literally every line Christopher Walken has as the Headless Horseman when he gets his head back. It's an interesting one, that. One I actually loved revisiting, and I tend to forget about it, but I saw this one at the cinema as a children's film, which is Paranorman. Paranorman, which sadly got buried when it was at the cinema, because it was at the cinema at the same time as Frankenweenie, I believe, the Tim Burton film. Two children's films using a sort of stop-motion animation style. The one of which, I mean, the Tim Burton film's really good, but it is nowhere near as good as Paranorman. Paranorman is absolutely brilliant. It is a sincere children's horror film, in the sense that it is genuinely scary, it uses horror tropes and horror subjects, but it does it in a way that's palatable to children. It's also one of those amazing children's films that gets the experience of children in a very sincere way, which most children's films do not. They are, the child characters tend to be little adults or little vessels for adult concerns about children. Here, it dares to give the child characters emotional complexity. It dares to acknowledge the difficulties that they face. It's a really good film. Also, great LGBTQ representation in a children's film. It's really, really good. But yeah, it's been a very interesting season, which capped off with a Halloween party at my colleague Lex Jones's house, which was great fun. Friend of the channel, of course, Lex, who's been on many, 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 many podcasts. It was an amazing time. Thank you very, very much indeed, Lex, and I look forward to the next one. So yeah, I hope you guys had a happy Halloween, and I certainly did. So until next time, bye bye, my loves.